Okay, so welcome back. Hello, everybody. I'm Massimo Leone, Director of the Center for Religious Studies at the Bruno Kessler Foundation. Today we have another meeting of our series of events dedicated to transformation and innovation in religion and ethics. And we have the great pleasure to have with us Professor Thomas Schlag, University of Zurich, who is a protagonist, I would say, world-class protagonist of the reflection on religion and new technologies, and in particular, religion and artificial intelligence. Professor Schlag is full professor of practical theology, but most importantly for us, it directs the URPP research program Digital Religions at the Faculty of Theology of the University of Zurich. And we were saying yesterday that is one of the oldest initiatives, one of the most prominent initiatives in this thematic field. He focuses primarily on three areas: public theology and theological communication, digital religious practices, and also in his network, international collaborations. In particular, he promotes practical theology globally through international research networks and projects, including confirmation studies and initiatives such as ConTalk, which investigates the impact of digitalization on the life of churches. So I'll now give him the floor. Professor Schlag, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Massimo, for inviting me to this place. Actually, my first time in Trento, but I enjoyed it already very much since yesterday. So I will go right into my presentation. You see three quite challenging terms: tradition, innovation, transformation. What I want to do is in five different, so to say, parts or sections. You see here the outline, to speak about something like the public Christian religious practice. Then I come to our own disciplinary and interdisciplinary research, second point. Then I will go to a more hermeneutical perspective in dealing with these questions. And I will also, I'm very much looking also forward to presenting you a very current research, or some parts of a very current research project within the larger framework of our program. Okay, now, starting with an initial question. Do religious and ecclesiastical reflections on tradition, innovation, and transformation serve to maintain, stabilize, or improve their own self-understanding and practice? So I start with that question because it's indeed now the challenge to ask, when we talk about these three terms, what is the aim of it? And that goes not only for Christian practices, but for all institutional religious practices. So do they want to maintain something? Do they want to stabilize, or maybe even improve, or maybe even transform their own practice, whatever transformation means? I pick up two quotes, first of all, by Grace Davy. She says, religious organizations are simply acting in the same ways as many secular institutions as they come to terms with the transformations of late modern societies, not least European ones. So it's not a very special thing for churches, even if their actors think they are in a genuine dramatic situation. They are not. That's actually true for all institutions. So it's interesting how she puts it. So we start with a transformation of society. What does that mean for the religious institutions? And another quote from a systematic theologian some years ago: the scarcity of tradition and the loss of contact with tradition must be taken seriously, but should not be dramatized. They present the Christian churches with the task of reflecting on what is truly fundamental, or simplifying the basic tenets of the Christian faith and translating them into the lives of those who are affected and damaged by the loss of tradition. So here you see, it should not be dramatized. It is a kind of a process in which the churches are in. And this might, just as a starting point, help to deal with issues of digitalization and digitality, not in the sense of what is happening with us? It's just kind of a transformational process. You could also speak in theological terms of a semper reformanda, which has always been the case in terms of the church's self-understanding. So maybe as a kind of a differentiation to approach the topic, it might help to differentiate innovation processes, to start with that, as I've put it here, as on one side internal innovation processes, so there are of course certain developments within the institutions, and secondly external innovations, which means in this sense that religion itself can influence these processes beyond their own realm, beyond their immediate sphere of religion. And Heidi Campbell and a colleague of hers have put it away that digital media and internet platforms are transforming religious practice in a digital age, and the impact this has had on religious culture, but also religions shape technology by the use of it. So this kind of innovation and maybe transformation is a kind of a reciprocal process, which is important to see. So it's not just coming from one side, it's actually influencing each other. Now, maybe a second helpful distinction I found from a technological sociologist from Germany, Jan Felix Schrape, and he speaks of digital transformation as a technically driven amplifier of social trends. So he says this process which we all face about polarization, social disruption, and so forth on different scales is of course amplified by also certain digitally induced transformation process. He uses now the term transformation. And what I find especially helpful in his understanding is that he comes up with something like dual dynamics. And that's most interesting also for religious institutions. So it's not just like one direction where you could say this is heading towards whatever flexibility or whatever. It's he detects something like this dynamics. It can be concrete in forms of decentralization and centralization. So his examples are from the market, from the labor work, from organizational developments and so forth. And there is always, what he says, this dual dynamic, so to say, of flexibilization, one hand, standardization on the other, agile processes, and also processes of control, and so forth. So it's important to look at these innovative or transformational perspectives and see where do they want to keep a certain, like tradition, and where do they want to open up, or where does it open up to something like transformation. In other words, this, what I call the triad, a dynamic triad in post-digital times, is actually something that is still very much connected to each other. So there is tradition, there is innovation, there might be transformation, and this is more or less a process of reciprocity and of negotiation. So negotiation is one of the big terms, of course, in the whole field. A third maybe helpful distinction is we had Pauline Chong, a communication scientist from the US, with us some time ago, and she had the challenge to elaborate on the idea of transformation, and she came up with kind of a metaphor: what happens, what transforms when the caterpillar becomes a butterfly. And again, you have this kind of reciprocity. So she says, even within the common metaphor of metamorphosis, older systems and learned behaviors persist in a certain sense, which may remind us of the evolutions in revolutions and the continuities with change, or within change. So again, you have this kind of negotiation process between, so to say, the DNA of a certain organization and its innovative and transformational dynamics. And finally, within this distinction, it might be worth saying that if we speak of transformation, there's also a kind of an ethical dimension. So two of my colleagues have put it the way, structurally speaking, actors can only be transformative if they are sustainable. or in terms of content, actions are transformative if they are mindful of historical, gender, cultural, social, and communication-related power dynamics. So in this reciprocal, triadic process and dynamic, there is also always the question, what is actually at stake in terms of the social or the ethical implications? Okay, now starting from there, I start with some transformation examples, although I must say, having now what I've said in mind, transformation is always also connected to certain traditions. And you see that here very lively in a sense. 2005, 2013 on the at the Peters Dome, the inaugurations or the kind of proclamation of the popes, 2005, 2013, that's quite a famous parallel picture, so to say. And you see what happened in the meantime. The smartphone was invented in 2007, and that changed the scene, and that changed the form of public appearance and public communication spaces. So just a very brief example. I follow up on, which I find quite exciting, again, in the field of transformation examples and public communication spaces. Leo XIV is actually very intensely, seems to continue what has been given or what has been said by Francis. And he started very soon after his inauguration, started a process, also a deliberate process with experts, or tech experts on AI. I don't know whether the Bruno Kessler Foundation was part of that. But anyway, so you see here, it's quite interesting, his quotes. Artificial intelligence, biotechnologies, and so forth are profoundly transforming our perception and our experience of life. And then he comes up with, so to say, his ethical stance. Human dignity risks becoming diminished or forgotten. And then he follows up saying, but the person is not a system of algorithms, he or she is a creature, a relationship and mystery. So you see there is this openness in a certain sense to continue not only the tradition from Francis, but a certain self-understanding of the Catholic Church as being almost, well, in their own self-understanding, the gatekeeper of an understanding of human dignity. And very interesting is this one, because this is only a few days ago. Dilexité, that's the new apostolic exhortation from 4th of October. And I will not go into details, and technology is hardly mentioned. It's only a very, very small topic in this paper. But it's interesting that he, where he mentions it, it's in the section of a history that continues. And so you see the semantics following up the tradition and then coming forward with some reflections on technology. Going back into the last 2 centuries, as you are all aware, he tries also to keep the tradition to the late 19th century popes working on questions of work and society. And then he says, that's very interesting, he says, a new tyranny is being born, invisible and often virtual, which unilaterally and relentlessly poses its own laws and rules. But the next one is interesting, because then he says that the help of science and technology might also be important by developing effective policies for societal change. So it's not a completely negative approach towards technology, not at all. So what he does is trying to bring together tradition, again, some forms of innovation, and maybe also transformation. Of course, in brackets, that's my interpretation, to keep a certain monopoly of what is going on in the field of religious practice in the digital space. Okay, some other more like image related examples of transformation. You see here something quite nice. That's the Großmünster in Zurich on the left-hand side, a remain from early times, 12th century. And on the right-hand side, you see a part of the cathedral in Fribourg. And the sculptures there did something interesting. When they built or renovated that entrance part of the cathedral, they've put down images of people using a smartphone. So this might be for the next generations to see what was the situation in 2016. So it might be a transformation of public symbols. The third one, you are probably quite aware of that. We have a transformation, we still have in a certain sense, of very classical rituals, the sacraments. You see here the Eucharist, you see a digital Eucharist. Down there you see a baptism, a classical baptism. And right-hand side, we're currently working on that. We do a larger study on the VR baptisms. There is a interesting web page, VR church baptisms, where you can actually not only follow baptisms, but you can get baptized by priests in the sense of an avatar. There are real people behind, but it's most fascinating to see how this works in terms of interaction, digital interaction. So things are changing. Next one, also important for us because we have a research project in that field. The classical pastoral care gets it's not a transformation in the sense that the classical forms are ending, not at all, but of course due to COVID, but also as a larger dynamic, we find forms of what we call telechaplaincy. So people that actually are staying, caregivers, they stay in offices and they are in contact with people via digital tools. Also a kind of interesting change. We have something like that, transformation of religious agencies. Okay, that's an own interesting phenomenon itself, the so-called religious influences, or we call them in German also synfluencers, so they come up with some kind of meaning. We have the blessing robots, other devices being built by colleagues like in Japan, Gabriele Trovato building these religious robots, devices, probes. And we had this very fascinating experiment in Lucerne last autumn with an AI Jesus. So that was a kind of a bot in the confession booth, and you can sit there and could get into contact with him. That's not actually a good picture, that's more a symbol for it. But the confession booth was like on one side, the real person, on the other side, there was a screen with a face, and the face looked a little bit like Jesus, and you could get in direct interaction, ask questions, receive answers, and so forth. And finally, also a project we're working on right now is the religious chatbots as something like AI companions. A lot of things are going on there, so they use that as pastoral care. You can go into conversation, so to say, with one of these biblical figures. There are many, many more of these religious chatbots coming up, and they obviously have a strong importance for people in getting some counseling or advice or whatever. And finally, of course, we have this kind of transformation from the other side, so from the tech industry, who themselves claim to give meaning, to open up transcendence, as you're probably aware of. And I mean, it's just a few examples. You see Zuckerberg, you see a book here, tagging as something like, what is Trost? Relief, maybe, in the sense of having somebody next to you, giving you some advice, also some empathy. And right-hand side, just a huge number of literature is dealing with these questions, very much on the brink of religious semantics and utopian or dystopian forms of trying to see what could be the future, actually. Okay, so these are just a few examples. I come to the second point now, actually, very briefly to our research priority program, because now we started with thinking about that in 2017, and we talked about that last night, Massimo. So maybe we came at the right time to get this started, because in 2017 it was still very kind of an exotic thing, at least for theology. People from communication sciences, media studies, also religious studies a little bit, they had started when working on the field quite some years before, but so there wasn't really a huge program being built on doing research on these dynamics. And as you see here, and that is not by chance, one of the crucial questions is actually the second one: to what extent do the dynamics of digitality manifest themselves in religious communication and so forth? So speaking of tradition, innovation, and transformation is a little bit tricky, as I said. So it might be, or we started with working on the term of dynamics. Something is going on, something is extending, enlarging, getting more speed in terms of reaching out, getting into conversation and all that. So we felt a little bit more secure about using the term dynamics than to say, because if you use the term transformation especially, you would have to do studies on like T1, T2, T3, and then to really see what has changed. So I'm a little bit hesitant to use that term too widely. Anyway, so and the question is also connected: is how does digital religious practice contribute to the good life, so to say? So that was the starting point, and then of course we dealt with things you are also aware of. I will be very, very brief on that. So to come up with Luciana Floridi, what does it mean to not only have an on-life sphere of communication, but what does that mean for religion, having this as an on-life phenomenon, 24/7? I mean, that changes a lot. And you see that on the right-hand side, it changes questions of what is community, if it's not only the Sunday morning or Sunday evening community. Who has the authority? And what do we understand here as religion? Should we still have quite huge debates about, shall we use the term spirituality instead of religion? Or shall we at least say religion/spirituality? And then asking about effects, of course, in terms of conflict, radicalization, or maybe dialogue or recognition. And again, we also work on the theological, ethical orientations, legal frameworks, and so forth. So that's about how we started. And very briefly, only maybe as a kind of a advertisement also, that was the first phase, 2021 to 2024. We tried to come up with two structured modules for working together interdisciplinary. So we started with internal dynamics, meaning what is going on, what I said at the beginning, what is going on within institutions, and external, more like how do they go public, what is happening in the public, in education, in spiritual care, in hospitals, in the legal system, and so forth. So in this book, with results of the first phase will actually come out very soon. I just send out the final galley proofs back to the publishing house. Okay, now this is the second phase, and we wanted to restructure, and Accusio is quite well informed about that. So we said we do not have two modules, internal, external. It was nice, but we maybe somehow have to reshape the whole thing. And we came forward with 4 clusters. As you can see here, the project in itself has been enlarged a little bit, or somehow, from 12 to something like 15, 16 projects now. And you see, we did a cluster structure with dealing with emerging technologies. That's very much the AI stuff. Beth has been with you here earlier this year. And originally, we thought that AI is mainly in cluster A, emerging technology, and we found out this is just not true. So AI is all over the place now, and which is an interesting development. Exactly, it's interesting. So when we started in 2017, 18, we thought, okay, there might be coming up something like that: post-humanism, transhumanism, maybe enhancement of digital developments, and so forth. But now it's of course everywhere, and that has a huge influence also on our work. But maybe also for you, being in a kind of an interdisciplinary cluster, what we find especially challenging, but in a positive sense, is that we have to do at least 4 different, we have to use 4 different approaches to this kind of holding the whole thing together. And the first one is a conceptual one. So we try to find what do we have in common. You see here on the right-hand side also some what we call cross-cutting themes: gender, global challenges, hermeneutical dynamics, the interreligious dimension, the religious psychological dimension. This is where we all deal with and have our bridge building between the clusters. So that's the conceptual thing. We have the social and ethical dimension in brackets, which is sometimes a challenge if you have people on board which are working mainly empirical, who do not really have the ethical questions so much on their screen sometimes, although they deal with ethical issues, but sometimes not easy to get them aware of that. We have, of course, an organizational perspective, transcending boundaries of disciplines and faculties. At the moment, it's 3 faculties altogether in the 3 to 4, depending on how you count, with I don't know how many different disciplines, maybe 7 or 8 at least. Okay, and then we have a cultural dimension, which is not to be underestimated, and Akusi knows about that. We have an own building since the second phase, so the university has spent as a building with 5 floors. So whoever likes to come to Zurich for a longer or shorter time, we have space, we have capabilities of hosting people and so forth. And that makes really a cultural difference to have the people in one building, at least for some times in the week. Very, very helpful for informal talks and all kinds of things. Okay, now coming a little bit into also the research in itself. And Massimo has mentioned that in terms now of these dynamics, we did so-called contact studies, churches online in times of and now after Corona. Also, the second book comes out soon. And we find these negotiation processes so we asked in the middle of COVID and then 2022, right at the, so to say, the end. And it was an interesting field study to see how church staff from Catholic and from Protestant side accommodates or adjusts to these digital challenges. We're still working on that very intensely. Also in the sense of, is there some kind of sustainability? What's been left over from the digital experiences after 2020 to 2024? I will not go into detail, but you see it's all here about negotiation. Still, the pastoral role, the practice, the forms of community, and the role of church in the media. So it's still a very open process, and we see that a huge number of church staff want to go back to the old norms, so to say. So they almost leave the field of digital practice in a sense, which from an analytical point is very interesting to really like going back to some kind of tradition and leaving out or not really seeing the innovative potentials. Maybe also to very briefly, it would be interesting to see how you use the term, the longer the more. We do not really speak of digitality, but rather post-digitality, of course. I mean, that is not in the sense of digitality is over, of course, but that it has already changed. It's become a ubiquitous part of everyday life. We have these forms of online, offline hybrids or hybridity. And I learned from a colleague from the UK, Maggie Savage-Baton, that in this post-digitality, you could also say there is a critical dimension to it. So it's almost also a kind of an ethical term coming up with it. So what is happening in this time where everything somehow is connected to digitality? Now, I come a little bit to this, what I said, the hermeneutical aspect. Now, what do we do with all these results and analysis? So what could be the outcome? So we do not have these kind of empirical analysis. We also have a broad ethical, systematical, hermeneutical reflection within the URPP, at least among several of the members and project. And I liked very much what Mark Kuckelberg came up, the Belgian, now in Vienna, teaching ethicist, and he speaks that in view of the acceleration, the ethical question of goodness can be addressed as a question of good times. I like that very much, so because it changes a little bit the direction. It's not only about how to live your life, but actually how to understand time and space in the field of these dynamics. So, and of course, his analysis is constant anxiety, temporal captivity are stressful, also in an existential sense. There is no time for the present, he says, due to the time pressure. So he's asking what is actually going on, what is a good time with digital technologies, and how can we look for something like meaning in this situation. And then he is not completely negative now about digital technologies, but he comes up with something I would call a processual thinking about it. So he says that digital technologies generate subjective experiences and generate meaning of existential significance. They can be understood as contributors to narrative processes of becoming. So he takes it not in the sense there is the subject, the human being, and I don't know what the object, technology. It's more like a co-creational dynamic, or it's co-creational processes, which can build up to new forms of coexistence, as he says. And from an anthropological point of view, he says we are in a state of becoming anyway all the time, and digital technologies can be a part of this becoming. But so humans will only play an active role, embodied role, if they take the potentials of digital technologies, but from what is really the existential meaning, so to say. So we are participants, he says, in techno performances of time. So that term is interesting because it combines the technological and the embodied kind of performative side of life. And then he comes up with, we need new techno performances that create opportunities for coexistence and kairos to emerge. Now, I became red ears when I read the term kairos, because this is something which I'm quite familiar with in theological terms. So I thought this is interesting to really also catch up upon. And so I take Kuckelberg as a really interesting kind of existential thinker and ethicist in the field, being very open to several traditions which might be helpful to understand better and to also shape some forms of meaningful use of technologies. So I just very briefly, from a hermeneutical perspective now, from theology, I've put it that way, raising awareness of the dimension of kairos could mean bringing educational subjects or subjects overall into a more conscious relationship with their own time. So there is actually also a tradition in pedagogy, religious education, about safe space and something like relevant time. So education not seeing as only like, giving knowledge or enhancing that kind of skills, but opening a certain space for self-understanding and reflection. And from a theological point of view, there is this theologia viatorum, so a theology on its way, again, a kind of a processual understanding of theology as a certain endeavor that adapts to social challenges, and is also interpreting the cultural formations we live in. So that's the idea of a very participatory understanding of theology and of the actors or the agents, and they use a mode what we call the theologizing. So theologizing not as a top-down form of communication about theological content, but more like a participatory almost experimental form of understanding what could be relevant for from theology or from theological tradition in times of digitality. Okay, now, as I said, a very brief insight into one of the projects. So these are, again, the 4 clusters, as you can see. Don't try to understand the complexity of the whole graph. It's difficult. But you see here, cluster C, that is the post-digital religious education cluster. So one of the 4, and you find in there the aims of the project. So how do adolescents, young adults engage with various communicative forms of AI tools? How do they interact? How do they interpret these encounters? So first of all, practice, understanding, and interpretation, and might also, in a certain sense, open up the perspective whether certain AI tools, in the sense, could maybe even foster critical competency. So the term of critical literacy is a very important topic for us. Can they maybe also enhance individual resilience and potentially even something like collective resistance? So that's, again, a political stance of the whole thing. Now, what we did is, in this project, we are, again, working participatory, also with images. So I'd just like to show you a little bit of this image-related field of the research. And that's not completely new. We had in religious digital religion research, there has been some articles and studies on religious memes. So in the sense of how do people produce, what could be the meaning of these memes, and you see here some quotes, common genres found amongst religious internet memes and core frames used to present messages and assumptions about religion online. This highlights trends towards something like a lived religion. So they have been studied from digital religion already, and also from media studies. But I will now try to put a little bit more a theological perspective onto it, also for our research and the research questions. So there is a huge debate on the meaning of the image in the German theological content since about 10, 15 years. And it's interesting that here the idea, Philipp Stöger, he's a systematic theologian in Heidelberg, says that the image is now, you could see it's not the style of description like religious studies do it or digital religion does it. It's more like also almost a substantial understanding of images, as you can see here. As he puts it, the image is a realistically effective imaginary and opens up an intensification of presence and an expansion of possibilities. And then he goes on saying there is this interpretation, but it always remains a fleeting illusion of presence. So this kind of tension between presence and fleetingness by seeing images or interpreting images is actually the starting point for this kind of participatory interpretation. So that's the theological idea of dealing with images. There might be something in it, in the sense of almost substantial, call it a message, call it a certain meaning, whatever. But it needs the interpreter to really, or the interpreter to really look into what could it be. And again, this is a form of reflection of what is in the images, what might be in the images. And so we focus in this project on a topic. You really have to condense it, and so we work in one of the projects with the term of love your neighbor. How is love your neighbor dealt with in terms of AI, so to say? That's so the long tradition of this quote, love your neighbor, does this appear somehow in digital tools, and which image receptions and image productions appear here? That's the question for this research project. Can AI be my neighbor? Colleagues from the States have come up with a whole book, The Techno-Sapiens in the Network Era, Becoming Digital Neighbors. Can AI be my neighbor? And one part of the first like experiment with AI looks like that. As you can see here, we started with asking ChatGPT, what is love your neighbor for? And again, tradition, innovation, and transformation. And as you all know, nowadays, DALL-E, whatever, does not only come up with an image, they give you a whole explanation of what they're working on or what they understand. And I find that very interesting, because what is happening here is that you, right from the start, you have a dialogical agency, I would call it. It's really a form almost of theologizing, if you want to take it in a broad sense. So what does ChatGPT say? Here you can see the scene with a modern depiction of the Good Samaritan in an urban setting. There had been some conversation before, so that's just a little part of a longer image generating process. ChatGPT came up with a very kind of secular form of having an old man on a bench and a mother and her child, and the child was giving this old man, I don't know what, money or flour or something. So there was no religious reference at all. So we had to kind of ask, and you see, and then at a certain point this came up. Also, now that's an interesting thing. That's what I mean by this dialogical form. Also, in the sense of ChatGPT tries to keep up, to continue the conversation. I mean, that's of course for whatever economic reasons probably. But nevertheless, if you like, he says, she says, it says, I don't know, we can now further personalize the scene, write out the Bible verse, place it differently, and so forth. How would you like to proceed? So it's interesting to have this kind of image building, not only in the sense of what is coming up, but in the sense, and that is what we're now doing, how do adolescents communicate with ChatGPT about this kind of stuff? So what kind of conversation is starting? So what we do here is, that's the way of the research, quite elaborated and a little bit complicated. So we detect the interaction in three phases. On the phase of perception, like could be images, could be conversation, texts, whatever. We want to also enhance or see how do they reflect on it, how do they judge on these traditions and images. And finally, it might also come to a certain way of acting. You can see the right hand, citizenship, agency, empowerment. These are two aspects of in a more broader educational sense. Okay, so that's the research process, and it's very much a citizen science process. So we've now changed also methodologies in the sense that we do not like only go out doing interviews or questionnaires, giving out questionnaires, but we integrate in this case, the teachers, the multipliers as co-researchers right from the beginning. And we are now, actually in 2 weeks' time, we will be starting a journaling project with the young people. So we will ask them about their own perceptions of what they understand. Love your neighbor. And then come forward with workshops. And it might be, and that's at the moment interesting maybe also for you, we are thinking of creating together with people from a human-computer interaction certain probes where they might even get a certain embodied understanding of love your neighbor. Very much at the starting point. Well, it would be interesting to see what our computer psychologists come up with in terms of creating probes. That's one of the steps, and then we're going to analyze, interpret, and further come up to outcomes and goals and so forth. So I'm not going into these preliminary theses, maybe just the first one to also connect to Beth in the context of the broader question of the relationship between AI and religion. Current technical possibilities raise questions about the image generating agency of AI itself and the interaction between technical, mechanical, and human actors. So from there, reception, production, interpretation is all like, again, in this process of tradition, innovation, and transformation. Whether theology itself will be transformed, and that was an idea that some people came up with some years ago. I'm not sure what that means to transform theology, but maybe to better understand certain contexts or traditions of theology might be an outcome of this whole dynamic. Okay, I end with an outlook, which I have created quite a while ago. That's not possible any longer, which I just found out, to use the Keith Haring images. I tried that again, and now ChatGPT says, due to copyright reasons, you are not allowed to use Keith Haring's works any longer, which I find also an interesting process. Anyway, I did this in 2022 in a longer conversation, but if so, is God then replaceable by human beings? The answer was no, God is not replaceable by human beings. God is an infinite and so forth. Now you get all the information. While humans can provide comfort and support, they cannot replace the spiritual connection that comes from the divine source. And I said, thank you for your answers. You seem to be almost a theologian. And then the final answer was, thank you, but I'm not a theologian. I simply believe that it's important to respect the beliefs of others and to recognize the limits of our own abilities. Okay, that might be also something for us as researchers, thinking about the limits of our own abilities. Whatever. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We just